Nestled in the heart of Beverly Hills, Carrie Fisher's former home was as eccentric and charismatic as the actress herself. A labyrinth of memorabilia, vintage furniture, and hidden stories, the estate had long been a Hollywood landmark filled with history, laughter, and perhaps something else. After Fisher's passing in 2016, her daughter, Billie Lourd, inherited the estate. For a few years, the house remained untouched, as if frozen in time. Then, in 2020, Billie and her husband, Austin Rydell, began renovations, intending to modernize the home while preserving its spirit. But soon after construction began, strange occurrences unsettled the crew. At first, it was little things, lights flickering, doors creaking open when no one was there. Workers reported hearing laughter echoing from empty rooms, a raspy chuckle that bore an uncanny resemblance to Fisher's own. Some dismissed it as faulty wiring or overactive imaginations, but others weren't so sure. One night, a contractor working late claimed he saw a woman's figure in the dimly lit hallway, standing still, watching. He assumed it was Billie and greeted her. But as he stepped closer, the figure simply wasn't there anymore. Billie herself had her own unsettling moments. Late at night, she would hear the piano in the living room play a few notes by itself. At first, she chalked it up to the house settling. But then there were the unmistakable scents, hints of Fisher's favorite perfume, Joy by Jean Patou, wafting through the halls with no apparent source. Guests visiting the home often spoke of an odd but warm sensation, as if an unseen presence was watching over them. Some felt a light touch on their shoulders when no one was around. Despite the eerie happenings, those who experienced them never described the presence as menacing. It was mischievous, yes, but never threatening, just like Carrie Fisher herself. Billie, ever pragmatic, joked that if her mother was haunting the place, she was probably doing it with a cocktail in hand and a sarcastic remark on her lips. To this day, the new owners, whether Billie or someone else, may continue to live with the lingering presence of Hollywood's most beloved princess. And perhaps, in the stillness of the night, a faint echo of laughter still lingers in the halls of the house that Carrie Fisher once called home. The night air hung thick over Beverly Hills, the kind of silence that pressed in on the walls of old homes, stirring memories like dust in forgotten corners. The house, Carrie Fisher's house, stood under the glow of the city's distant lights, its walls heavy with the weight of time. The renovations had altered parts of it, new fixtures, fresh paint, but the bones of the place remained the same, as if unwilling to let go of the past. Billie had always known this house was different. Even before the whispers, before the scent of Joy perfume that lingered in doorways where no one had stood, before the piano keys hummed to life under unseen fingertips, she had felt it. It was in the way the air seemed to shift in certain rooms, the way shadows stretched a little too long in the corners, the way silence, at times, was not silence at all. The workers, hardened men who had spent years tearing apart and rebuilding Hollywood's grandest estates, whispered among themselves. They spoke in hushed tones about their tools moving on their own, about a chill that followed them when they worked past dusk. One man, the electrician, had walked off the job entirely, muttering about something not right in the wiring room. When asked what he meant, he just shook his head, his face pale. Billie dismissed most of it. Houses had quirks, especially old ones. Her mother's home had always been eccentric, much like Carrie herself, filled with oddities, mismatched furniture, walls covered in the artifacts of a life lived loudly and without fear. It wasn't a polished mansion, not the kind that Hollywood's elite sought to display their wealth. It was a home built from memories, layered in history, and draped in the essence of a woman who never quite left it behind. Then came the voice. It was late, past midnight, when Billie sat alone in the dimly lit den. A single lamp cast long shadows against the deep red walls, its glow barely reaching the sprawling collection of books that lined the shelves. She had been meaning to sort through them, her mother's books, filled with handwritten notes in the margins, sarcastic scribbles that turned even the most serious literary works into something unmistakably Carrie. She had just pulled one from the shelf when she heard it. A soft hum, low at first, almost imperceptible, like someone humming a tune just under their breath. A melody she knew but couldn't quite place. Her fingers tightened on the book's spine. The air around her seemed to hold still, as if the house itself was listening. "Mom!" Her own voice sounded too loud in the hush of the room. Nothing. The hum had stopped, but the air still felt thick, charged, like the moment before a storm. She let out a slow breath, shaking her head. Just her imagination. It had to be. But then, from the hallway, came a sound she could not explain away. A soft, deliberate shuffle, like the faint drag of bare feet over the polished wood floor. Not the old house creaking. Not the distant sound of the city beyond the gates. Something else. Something inside. Billy stood, heart pounding against her ribs, every hair on her arms standing on end. The hallway was dark, but she could see the faintest glow of the moon spilling through the windows, illuminating the space just enough to see that no one was there. She swallowed hard, forcing out a laugh. "Okay," she said, more to herself than anything. "If you're gonna haunt me, at least do something cool." For a long moment, there was nothing. Just the quiet, the weight of the house settling around her. Then, just as she turned to go back to the den, something brushed past her. Not a gust of air, not the natural shift of space, something real. Something felt. Presence brief but undeniable. Billy let out a sharp breath, her pulse hammering, and then the scent came. Faint but unmistakable. The perfume. Joy. She closed her eyes, a slow, strange smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "Mom!" The house didn't answer. But then, in the far room, the piano played a single note. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The single note from the piano hung in the air longer than it should have, stretching out like the last breath of a whispered secret. Billy didn't move. She only listened. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was thick, full of something unseen but undeniably present, curling around the edges of the room like a dense fog rolling in from the Pacific. Her mother's house had never been quiet. Not really. Even in the dead of night it had a pulse, a rhythm. A place so full of stories could never truly be still. She exhaled and stepped toward the hallway, the old wooden floor groaning beneath her weight. The shadows stretched long in the dim light, warping the familiar contours of the house into something unfamiliar, something shifting. The piano stood just beyond the next room, an elegant thing that had always seemed too refined for Carrie's chaotic energy. Billy could still remember her mother leaning against it, drink in one hand, a cigarette dangling from the other, tapping a single key absent-mindedly as she spoke in a voice full of sarcasm and warmth. She turned the corner slowly, expecting nothing. The piano was as she left it, closed, untouched. The bench was still tucked beneath it, slightly askew from the last time she sat there. No signs of movement, no phantom fingers pressing down on ivory keys. And yet, the air smelled of smoke. Not cigarette smoke, not the acrid scent of something burned, but the ghost of it. A memory lingering just past perception. Billy hesitated, her fingers grazing the edge of the piano. "Mom?" she whispered again, softer this time. The house did not answer, but it didn't have to. It was breathing, shifting, listening. She shook her head, laughing to herself. "Jesus, I'm losing it." The old chandelier overhead swayed gently, its crystal pendants catching the low glow of moonlight from the garden window. There was no draft, no open doors, nothing to explain the movement. She didn't scare easily. She had grown up in a world of fantasy and ghosts on movie sets, in stories whispered backstage, in a home filled with relics of a past that never quite faded. She had always believed in the possibility of things unseen, but experiencing them was another matter. The next morning, she decided to say nothing. Not to Austin, not to the workers who trudged through the house, tearing out old tiles and replacing century-worn wiring. They already whispered about the things they felt, the cold spots, the misplaced tools, the shadows in their peripheral vision that disappeared when they turned. Billy heard them talking when they thought she wasn't listening. "She's still here," one of them muttered to another as they carried drywall through the foyer. "I swear to God, I felt someone watching me in the blue room." The blue room, Carrie's bedroom. Billy clenched her jaw and moved past them, pretending not to hear. That night, she lay awake in her childhood room. The one she had abandoned as a teenager when the world outside had called louder than the home she was raised in. The walls were different now, new paint, new furniture, but beneath the surface. It was the same room where she had dreamed as a child, listening to her mother's voice carry through the halls at all hours of the night. She closed her eyes and let the memories settle around her. She almost didn't notice the whisper at first. Soft, so soft it might not have been a voice at all. It might have been the wind, the creak of the house, a trick of her exhausted mind. But then she heard it again. A single word, not spoken with breath, but felt. Hey! Billy's eyes shot open, her heart lurching into her throat. The room was the same. Nothing had moved. No one was there. And yet, she wasn't alone. The whisper did not fade like a distant sound. It lingered, stretching into the silence as if it had weight, as if it was pressing against the very air in the room. Billy lay frozen, her breath shallow, her mind racing to rationalize what she had just heard. A dream. It had to be. She had drifted between wakefulness and sleep, and her mind had conjured the word from the depths of her subconscious. That was the only explanation. And yet the room felt changed. It wasn't colder, not exactly, but the air felt heavier, as if unseen hands had smoothed over the surface of everything, the walls, the bed, the very fabric of the night. Billy swallowed hard and turned her head toward the doorway. The hallway beyond was black, an abyss untouched by the glow of the city outside. The door was slightly ajar. She had closed it before getting into bed. She was sure of it. Her fingers gripped the covers, a childhood reflex, a silent attempt to shield herself from something she wasn't ready to face. Another sound, a shift in the air. Not a whisper this time, a movement, slow, measured, the unmistakable creak of a footstep on the wooden floor. Billy's pulse slammed in her ears, a frantic drumbeat drowning out reason. She knew the sounds of this house, every groan of the foundation, every rattle of the old pipes, every whisper of the wind through the antique windows. This was not the house settling. This was something else. She forced herself to breathe, long and deep, steadying the tremor in her hands. And then, like a slow tide retreating from the shore, the presence pulled away. The air lightened. The weight lifted. The room was just a room again. Billy remained still for what felt like an eternity, waiting for something more, a sign. Another whisper. Another sound in the dark. But nothing came. Eventually, exhaustion won. Her body surrendered, and her eyes fluttered shut, sleep dragging her under like an unseen current. Morning came with a soft, golden light filtering through the sheer curtains, casting long patterns across the wooden floor. The weight of the night felt distant, unreal, like the fading memory of a dream. Billy sat up slowly, rubbing her temples, trying to shake off the lingering unease. The house was alive with movement. The construction crew had already arrived, their voices carrying from the front of the house where the renovations had stalled. Something about the wiring, faulty connections, inconsistent power, an entire circuit refusing to hold. She made her way downstairs, the scent of fresh coffee mingling with the dust and sawdust from the ongoing work. Austin was already at the kitchen counter, scrolling through his phone, his free hand wrapped around a steaming mug. He glanced up as she entered. "Did you hear that last night?" he asked, his tone casual but curious. Billy paused, her fingers tightening around the back of a chair. "Hear what?" Austin shrugged. "I don't know. Thought I heard you walking around. I called your name, but you didn't answer." He took a sip of coffee, unfazed. "Maybe I dreamed it." Billy forced a smile, nodding. "Yeah, maybe." She sat down, but her mind was elsewhere. Austin wasn't the type to imagine things. He wasn't prone to late-night paranoia or half-remembered dreams. And more importantly, she hadn't been the one walking around. She kept her thoughts to herself as the morning unfolded, moving through the motions of the day. But no matter how much she tried to push it aside, the feeling remained. Something had shifted in the house. It had always been full of echoes, memories of laughter, of voices that once filled these rooms. But this was different. This wasn't a memory. This was something that was still here. And it wasn't leaving. By late afternoon, The house hummed with the sounds of construction hammers striking nails, drills biting into old wood, footsteps echoing through the halls as workers carried supplies from room to room. Dust hung in the air, catching the slant of sunlight that filtered through the high windows. Billy moved through it all like a ghost herself, her mind tangled in the events of the night before. The whisper, the presence, the quiet retreat of something unseen. She told herself she had imagined it, that stress and exhaustion were playing tricks on her, but doubt clung to her like a second skin. The workers had noticed something too. She caught the way they spoke in hushed voices, the way they glanced over their shoulders when they thought no one was watching. The electrician Dan, she thought his name, was stood in the hallway near the blue room, shaking his head as another man pointed at the open circuit panel. "I'm telling you, the wiring's fine," Dan muttered, his voice low but firm. "Every time we fix it, something else shorts out. It doesn't make sense." Billy stopped near the staircase, pretending to check her phone, listening. The other worker, lean, wiry, with dust coating his jeans, exhaled sharply. "Maybe the place doesn't want to be fixed." He said it half-jokingly, but neither of them laughed. Dan scratched his jaw, glancing toward the open doorway of her mother's old room. The blue room, the air seemed heavier there, as if the very walls held their breath. "I don't know, man," Dan murmured, "but it feels off." A slow shiver crawled down Billy's spine. She forced herself to keep walking, keep moving, even as something inside her twisted, whispering that they were right. The house was resisting. That evening, after the workers had left and the last traces of daylight melted into the horizon, Billy wandered the halls alone. The chandelier in the main room swayed slightly, though the air was still. The thick scent of sawdust and old wood clung to the walls, mixing with something else, something faint but familiar. Perfume. The same ghostly trace of joy that had drifted through the house the night before. She stopped in the doorway of the blue room. The furniture had been moved out weeks ago, leaving behind bare floors and faded patches on the walls where framed photos had once hung. This was where her mother had spent so many nights writing, laughing, existing in the space between reality and the stories she created. Billy stepped inside, her fingers trailing along the doorframe. The air was different in here, heavier, charged. She swallowed. "Mom!" Silence. Not an empty silence, but one that felt waiting. She hesitated, then moved toward the window. Outside, the garden stretched into the darkness, the trees shifting slightly in the night breeze. The pool glowed with a dull blue light, its surface undisturbed. A memory surfaced, unbidden. Billy, no more than 10, floating in that pool late at night, the sky endless above her. Her mother sat on the edge, barefoot, her silk robe slipping from her shoulders. She had been smoking, watching the embers flicker in the dark, her mind somewhere far away. "You ever wonder if houses remember?" Carrie had said suddenly, flicking ash into the water. Billy, weightless in the water, had tilted her head. "Remember what?" Carrie had smiled, wistful, unreadable. "Everything." Now, standing in the hollowed-out remnants of that room, Billy felt the truth of it pressing down on her. The house remembered. She turned to leave, but something stopped her. A shift in the air. The door, opened just a moment ago, was now closed. She stared at it, heartbeat hammering. A slow, creeping sensation curled at the edge of her awareness, like someone standing just behind her. Close enough to touch. Close enough to whisper in her ear. She swallowed hard, her breath coming shallow. A floorboard creaked. Not beneath her feet. Behind her. Billy turned, pulse roaring in her ears. And for just a second, just the briefest, flickering moment, she saw it. A shadow. A figure. A shape that should not have been there. And then, gone. The air rushed back into her lungs like she had been drowning. The room was empty, but Billy knew. She was not alone. Billy stood frozen in the dim glow of the room, heart pounding, breath shallow. The presence was gone, vanished as quickly as it had appeared, but the feeling lingered, clinging to the air like smoke after a fire. She forced herself to move, reaching for the door handle with trembling fingers. It was cold, unnaturally so. With a sharp breath, She yanked it open and stepped into the hallway, leaving the blue room behind. That night, she didn't sleep. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the events of the past days looping in her mind. The whispers, the shifting air, the scent of joy, the shadow. The house remembered, and so did her mother. In the morning, she made a decision. She wouldn't fight the house. She wouldn't try to silence it, to erase what was still here. This had been her mother's home, filled with chaos and laughter, pain and love, the remnants of a life lived without restraint. And maybe, just maybe, some part of Carrie wasn't ready to leave it behind. Billy ran a hand over the wall as she walked downstairs, a small smile tugging at her lips. "If you're gonna haunt me," she murmured, "at least make it fun." The chandelier above gave a faint, almost imperceptible sway, and somewhere just at the edge of hearing, a soft, familiar laugh. The end. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.